Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Kellie Carter Jackson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College, author of We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. Welcome to the program, Kellie.
Hey, happy Black History Month.
Thank you. You too. Let's start with, let me ask you, why this book for you, and in terms of like the timing context?
Oh man, so this book has been ruminating for years, really since 2020 is when I started writing it. And I tell everybody I wrote it because I was mad. I was angry, and I was frustrated at the way that the protests of 2020 had materialized and had not really led to like structural or systemic change. I'm frustrated with protests writ large and sort of like hashtag activism. And I wanted to also get outside of the bubble of like violence and nonviolence. I think we have these like really limiting ideas of what we think nonviolence is and what we think violence is. And I wanted to push back on that and kind of expand it and say, like, we have more than two tools, just, a hashtag or a protest or a Molotov cocktail. Like, there's got to be more tools in our tool belt than just those two ideas. And so this book, We Refuse, really is about looking at all the ways that Black people have resisted from the Haitian Revolution until this present moment.
Why do you think, and I know this is a little tangential to the book, and we'll get into that in a second, but why do you think that we did see, why do you think that those protests did not have the traction that in the moment it felt like they could have?
Yeah, it felt like there was a lot of groundswell. It felt like there were a lot of vibes, if you will.
Yeah, and just in sheer numbers. I mean,
in sheer numbers, for sure.
I didn't see anything like that since maybe the Iraq War,
absolutely.
And the number of protests, I don't think even existed during Iraq at that time. Even like Occupy, there was nothing really to rival that. It was close, but why do you think none of that?
I think part of the fact that we had so much attention, I think I give credit to the pandemic. I mean, people had paused globally, and so when something like George Floyd's murder goes viral, you have way more eyeballs on this event than you probably would have had there not been the pandemic, had we not been sort of forced to shut down and lock in. And I think people were paying attention, and people were upset, and people realized just how much racism is also a public health crisis. And there were so many things colliding in that moment that I think made sort of the nation come to a standstill. But I also think that in this country, we have a very difficult time, one, having conversations about race. We have an even more difficult time when it comes to doing systemic or structural change. If it costs us something, if we have to relinquish power or control, we have a hard time accomplishing that. And I think that for a lot of reasons, we didn't see the change that we wanted. We saw like street names change or statues come down, and Jemima got like a remix. And I'm like, this is not what we asked for. This is actually not what people petitioned for. People were talking about true police reform, like actually abolishing their police. People had revolutionary ideas. And those things never really got tackled in ways that I felt like were structural. We got more symbols. We got more trinkets because it's cheaper.
But I just, one more question. But why? I mean, because I hear you say like, yeah, no, it's true. Power is not going to relinquish. Nobody's going to relinquish power.
Yeah.
But what short circuited where the taking of that power did not happen?
I think that when it comes down to it, the hard truth is we have been unwilling to recognize our deep allegiance to white supremacy, our deep allegiance to power and position and privilege as white Americans, that people don't really want to let go of all of the advantages that allows, that fortifies them to have. And so you get a deep pushback. I mean, and we've seen this throughout history. Every time you get Black history, even if that history is somewhat progressive, is even symbolically progressive, you get widespread backlash, political backlash, economic backlash, social backlash. You've seen it in Reconstruction. You've seen it in the 1920s and 30s. You've seen it in the Civil Rights Movement. And what we saw right after the summer of 2020 was was deep political backlash. I mean, it's not a coincidence that January 6th happens right after that. There's anti-DEI backlash that sweeps across the country. People do not want to let go of their power and privilege and position. And I also think that we have seen that nonviolence, and in some cases when it comes down to protest and petitions and hashtags, it doesn't work. It's ineffective. And we need new tools. We need new ideas. We need to be creative about pushing ideas that really will work.
And how much of it is what you talk about? I guess the history of there's two things I feel like that work together here is like the individualization of racism as opposed to making it a systemic thing where people feel like it has to do with their own work internally as opposed to deep structural change, which I think benefits white supremacy. But really also that the other piece is the sanitization of violence in history in terms of Black resistance is really important here. Because, you know, there's a reason it's not in this country, but how long was Nelson Mandela on the U.S. terror watch list? What, until 2007, 2008? Can you speak about, like, where did that begin? Where did... maybe it's Reagan with MLK Day. Like, where did...
I mean, I think you're onto something. I mean, when we think about MLK, he was hated. He was despised. If he had poll numbers in the 1960s, they would have been in the low numbers. I mean, people did not like MLK, especially when he started speaking out against the Vietnam War, especially when he started talking about capitalism and basically saying, like, this is going to cost you. You've gotten civil rights on the cheap. You need to pay up. You know, we need to move into human rights and reparations. People didn't want to hear from King. And then after he got assassinated, and then decades later, we get this sanitized, very diluted version of King that's very much, nostalgic and romanticized. But that's not really what King was standing up for. I think we have amnesia when it comes to, like, our leaders. You know, when we think about Malcolm X and the idea that he was pushing this by any means necessary and really building global coalitions across people of color, the things that he was doing put a target on his back. And we forget those things. We forget the things that made people sort of unsavory. Even early in Nelson Mandela's career, he also had championed using force and using violence, and we forget that. And so I think history for me is the greatest weapon. It's one of the greatest tools that I have in sort of correcting the record and letting people know, hey, we have been here before. We have done this before. Here's what's worked. Here's what hasn't worked. and using history as a blueprint, if you will.
Let's start as we address these, and I think you just touched a little bit on chapter 3, force. You've divided the book into basically 5, I guess, elements of, within the spectrum of what, arrows in the quiver, I guess, of resistance. But let's start with your great-grandmother's resistance, because this is one where, I mean, she paid a price individually, but also she was faced with an individual price to pay otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about my grandmother, this is my grandmother Rita, my father's mother. When she passed away, we were cleaning out her apartment and we realized that she had a gun in her nightstand. And we were like, what? Grandma's got a gun? And, we were kind of shocked by that because I had, these, again, memories of my grandmother being this sweet lady that made, like, lemon meringue pie. I didn't think of her as someone who would be gun-toting. And yet, when I think about how she grew up, my grandmother may have died in Detroit, but she was a Southerner. She was born in Louisiana. And she told me stories about how her brothers and her uncles would have to go to jail on the weekends. And I was like, what do you mean they had to go to jail on the weekends? And she would say, well, yeah, back then, all the white men would get drunk and they would lynch any Black man in town. So if you were already in jail, that was your alibi. And I just could not fathom prison being a safe space for Black men, prison being a space that would be a refuge on the weekends when white men are getting drunk and lynching anyone. And you didn't want someone to say that you had sexually assaulted or raped a white woman. And so you went to jail. And then on Sunday morning, you went out and you went to church. And that to me showed me that my grandmother was growing up in an environment where white terrorism was very real, and it was heightened on the weekends. It was weekly, and she had to protect herself. She had to arm herself. And I talk all in that chapter of Force about Black women in particular that have used their Second Amendment rights to defend themselves, particularly from the Ku Klux Klan, particularly from white supremacists that would try to firebomb their houses, that would try to destroy their communities. People like Rosa Parks talked about how her kitchen table was covered with guns. Ida B. Wells talked about the importance of having guns in her home and protecting herself from the Klan. So these are the lived experiences that Black people face that we often don't talk about. Even MLK talked about his home being an arsenal. He had a friend who came over to his house and he was like, "Whoa, don't sit there. There's a whole bunch of guns and pistols underneath that seat." Like, he might have believed in nonviolence, but he also believed in self-defense, and he did not see them as in opposition.
What about Arnesta? I guess I'm thinking of too.
Oh, Arnesta. So Arnesta was my great-grandmother who I opened the book with her. I talk about how when she was 9 years old, she stepped on a rusty nail and likely got tetanus, a serious bacterial infection, and she could have died. And my great-great-grandmother took her really to the only white doctor she knew, this white man who lived in a big house.
When was this? What year? What about
This
what year?
is 1915. This is rural Alabama in 1915. So 50 years out from slavery. And this white doctor offers to help her. But in exchange, he says that Arnesta has to live with him and work for his family for the rest of her life. She is 9 years old. It is 1915. She is a girl. This is a position in which she could be susceptible or vulnerable to sexual exploitation, to all kinds of physical violence, let alone that slavery had been abolished. And what I'm so grateful for is my great-great-great-grandmother, whose name I just found out was Martha. Martha intervened and refused the doctor's proposal. She said, "Absolutely not, no way, in fact, never." And she picks up her ailing granddaughter, Arnesta, finds every concoction she can think of in her household, and she saves Arnesta's life. And for the rest of her life, Arnesta walked with a limp. And I talk about how that experience is very akin to the Black experience, that oftentimes the choices you are given are to live life in bondage or to refuse and limp. That racism and white supremacy handicaps you. And we don't talk about all the full ways that it has a detrimental effect on Black people's lives, that Black people spend most of their lives responding to, addressing, or avoiding the violence of white supremacy.
All right. Well, you and so in going through the sort of different elements of a response to oppression. The first is revolution, and you talk about the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah,
we've covered the Haitian Revolution a decent amount here over the years. It was maybe the only first, like sort of like maybe not just the first, but maybe the only complete sort of revolution, decolonizing and slave uprising, certainly in that era, and one which the Haitian people, to ultimately get the French to stop embargoing them, had to pay the value that France lost in the loss of their slaves, the free labor.
Yes,
and
they paid reparations to
slaveholders, and that represented something like 25% of its GDP up until not that long ago. And so when we look at Haiti as a country that's, has all sorts of problems, contemplate the idea of this country having to pay 40% of its GDP over the course of 150 years or something. It's just absurd. But go ahead, talk about the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah, the Haitian Revolution. I mean, I feel like we don't do it justice. We make it a footnote in history, and I feel like it's a feature. In the age of revolutions, when we think of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution is the only revolution that actually abolishes the institution of slavery. In the United States, you have slavery for another 100 years. So they're talking about liberty and equality and independence, and Black people are still enslaved. Like, Black people are actually serving Thomas Jefferson while he's drafting the Declaration of Independence. Like, George Washington is sending out slave catchers while he's also fighting the British, while he has enslaved people running away from him. Like, the hypocrisy knows no bounds. But when we think about Haiti, it's an all-Black republic. It overthrows a European empire. It defeats Napoleon's empire. And it basically says, and we will be a free nation. We will be a free Black nation. And they paid heavily for that. They paid heavily for that, not just in the tax that came in terms of reparations for slaveholders, but in the way that we talk about the Haitian Revolution, the way that we have dealt with Haitians. It took until the Civil War for Haiti to actually get diplomatic recognition from the United States. It took a long time for Haiti to get back on its feet. And even then, the United States invades in 1915 and occupies it for another 20, 30 years. And we've seen all these different, puppet dictators that pop up. I think part of that is because, again, our unwillingness to acknowledge like what Black empowerment could look like, what it could be, what it could do, its full capacity. And I often say that the hardest part of a revolution is actually not achieving it, it's sustaining it. It's making it lasting. And even when we look at the American Revolution, I say that America was like conceived of in 1776, but it's not really born until 1863, until 1865, until you get the Emancipation Proclamation, until you get, the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery. The United States really isn't the United States it could be until it reconstructs itself. And I see that as its revolution. I see that as its birthplace, really.
Let's talk about the concept of protection as we're looking at the sort of like the different, I guess, responses to, in some way, an unjust system. You write about Margaret Garner. About just before the Civil War, I guess this would be in the 1850s.
Yeah, 1853. She's an enslaved woman who is running away with her family, with her husband and with her in-laws and their 4 children. And they lived in the slave state of Kentucky, which is a border state to Ohio. And during the winter, they decide to steal a horse and a sled, and they are going to make their way to the free state of Ohio. And they cross the river, which is frozen solid at the time, and they make their way to Ohio, and they're only there for a few hours before slave catchers, inevitably follow their tracks through the snow, follow them to Ohio, to where a family member's house that they were staying in. And Margaret Garner makes this horrific decision where she decides, I cannot go back to slavery. I will not send my children back to slavery. It is a fate worse than death. And so she decides to kill her children, that she would rather have them die than have them go back into slavery. And so she winds up slitting the throat of her youngest child. It's horrific. She's telling her mother-in-law, help me, mother, help me kill the children. It is terrible. It is blood everywhere. There's banging outside the door. The U.S. Marshals are there. They're trying to ram in the door. And when they finally get the door open, they see this bloodbath. They see her youngest child, Scylla, that has been slain. They see her attempting to try to kill another child. It is an awful, awful, unimaginable moment. And it's one of 2 things happens. One, the South uses it as a way to say, see, Black women are unfit to be mothers. They're not good mothers, and she should be punished for this. It's another way for the abolitionist movement to see, slavery is so horrible. It is so violent. It would drive someone to kill their children. And really, Margaret Garner is left in the middle of that, trying to reconcile what is the best decision that she could make for her children. And as a mother of 3 kids, I have a 10-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old. I cannot imagine being in that predicament. But it does shed light just on how violent slavery was and how much parents did not want their children to experience it. The coroner's report talked about how Scylla was very fair skinned, how she had, like blonde hair and blue eyes, which to me says that she was probably a child of sexual assault, that rape was rampant in slavery. And this was something she did not want her daughter to experience. Later, Margaret Garner winds up dying in the institution of slavery, and her husband lives, and on her deathbed, she says, promise me that you will marry a free woman next. Promise me that you will not have any more children in slavery. And it's a harrowing story, but it's one that I wanted to talk about in terms of the chapter protection, because I felt like protection is such a radical act, that what she did feels so extreme to us, but at its heart, she was trying to express the greatest form of care and love and protection that she could give for her children, which was to keep them from the institution of slavery.
You also talk about the Underground Railroad under that rubric. I think it's somewhat self-evident, but it is, the idea, I guess, is really just sort of like what constitutes a very practical, pragmatic response. Maybe not necessarily pragmatic. I mean, but a practical response.
Pragmatic. I think that applies. I mean, when you think about the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, it basically said that if you ran away from your slave master, that you could be retrieved. And it didn't matter if you ran away 5 days ago, 5 years ago, you could be living longer in freedom than you were in slavery. You could be returned to your master. It meant that the new Mason-Dixon line was Canada's border. So you really only had two options as a Black person. You could flee, you could try to get to Canada, or you could stay and you could stand your ground. And that's what the abolitionist movement was, and the Underground Railroad was. It was a collection of Black people that said, we're going to protect you by any means necessary, even at the risk of our own lives. And so I tell all of these really heroic stories of Black people and their white comrades that came to the help of these fugitives and helped them get to freedom and help them get either to the north or further north or get to, Europe or Canada. And these are stories that I think about now in my own 21st century mind. I'm like, man, would I have had the gall? Could I have hit someone? Could I have, threatened the U.S. Marshal? Could I have put my own risk at life? I don't know. But during those times, people put everything on the line to protect not just their family members, but strangers to help them get to freedom.
You mentioned, you touched on a little bit of force and the idea of, that people that we wouldn't have necessarily contemplated, your grandmother, I don't know. But were armed, and that the idea of arming themselves. Talk a little bit, tell us who Carrie Johnson is.
Oh, Carrie Johnson. These are all good stories. These are all in the book. Carrie Johnson is a 17-year-old Black girl who's living in 1919 in Washington, D.C. And during 1919, historians know it as the summer of Red Summer. It's when racial riots are taking place all across the country. And so in Chicago and Little Rock and Washington, D.C., all across the country, there are these race riots, really massacres, where Black communities are being under attack by the Klan and white supremacists. And in DC, the mob is at bay, and they are going through the Black neighborhood, and they are pulling Black people out of their homes. They're beating them up. They're throwing rocks into their homes. They're shooting in Black communities. They're dragging Black folks off streetcars to beat them up. They're lynching Black people on the spot. It is incredible. Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Month, is walking home from Howard University, and he sees a lynching take place right in front of him in DC. And so Carrie is this 17-year-old girl who's armed, and her father tells her, hey, listen, get high ground, get to the roof or to the second floor. If you see someone coming, you defend our household. And that's what she does. The mob comes marching down, about 1,000 strong of white people marching through her Black neighborhood. And she starts to take pot shots at the mobbers that are coming down her block. And the crazy thing is that there are police officers that are there, and they're not stopping the mob. Matter of fact, they're encouraging the mob. And the mob says to them, hey, there's someone in that window. There's someone taking shots at us. And so the police gather up and they go to Carrie's house. They don't knock on the door. They just knock the door down. They don't announce themselves. They go into this dark house, and Carrie and her father are hiding in her bedroom on the second floor. And as the officers creep up the door of the stairwell of this dark house, and they open up her bedroom, and immediately Carrie starts shooting. She is fearing for her life. She doesn't know who's on the other side of that door. And police officers are shooting at the walls. They don't know where the bullets are coming from. And within moments, Carrie is shot in the shoulder, her father is shot in the thigh, and Officer Harry Wilson is shot fatally, and he lay on the floor dying. And they drag Carrie and her father from under the bed. They march them out to the street. They cannot believe that a 17-year-old Black girl has fatally wounded this police officer. And the crowd and the mob is sort of standing there, almost ready to lynch Carrie. And at that moment, it begins to rain, torrential rain pour down. And that is what saves her life. That is what quails the mob. And everyone decides to go home because it's raining. It's pouring outside. And the crazy thing about Carrie is that there's a trial. She's convicted. They appeal. And she's acquitted. They don't want to charge her anymore. They release her at 19 years old. She's free to go. And I'm like, what? It's 1919. This Black girl kills a cop, is free to go. What in the world? I mean, these are different times for sure. But I think part of it was that there was a lot of shame in the white community that this white officer could be killed by a Black teenage girl. And they didn't even want to put in the headline. They put in the headline, white officer killed by Negro. They wouldn't say that it was a girl. They wouldn't say that she was 17. They did not want to point attention to who she was. And it was thankfully the Black press that told her story over and over and kept it in the headlines so that she could get justice and for defending herself. And eventually that's what the judge says. The judge drops the charges and says she defended herself.
Do you think it was shame, or was it not wanting to reveal a potential vulnerability?
I think it was both. I think it was absolutely both. I think this is the only riot in the summer of 1919 where the white casualties are higher than the Black casualties, where there are 10 white people that are killed. And this sent a message that Black people would defend themselves, that they would be armed, that a lot of Black people who participated in this riot, they were veterans. They were coming home from World War I and they came home armed. And they were like, oh, here's what you're not going to do. We just fought and died and bled for this country. You're not going to ramshackle our communities. And they did not want to send a message of what an empowered Black populace could look like. And so a lot of these stories get buried. So a lot of my work as a historian is about trying to uncover these stories and to say, look at what happens when Black people fought back. These rebellions, these race riots get quailed when white people realize that their lives could equally be at risk.
And when you talk about that one, I mean, the invocation of the imagery, it reminds me of Breonna Taylor, but also, it reminds me about the historical either whitewashing or ignoring of groups like the Black Panthers, right? And their both armed resistance and also usage of basically kind of community solidarity to build a fortress against these factors. Because at the time, I guess the question is the role of the state in violence like this, when we're now beginning to explore the Malcolm X assassination and the police's role in that violence. Can you talk about how that threat evolved of armed resistance, particularly in the civil rights movement?
Yeah, the police were not a friend to the Black community. They were not about the business of protecting and serving Black communities. And part of the reason the Black Panther Party started, it was initially the Black Panther Party for self-defense, was to protect Black people and Black communities from police assault, from police brutality. They would do this thing called cop watch, where basically if someone got pulled over by the cops, the Black Panthers would show up and they would watch, kind of like the same way we do with our cell phones today, where we have an eyewitness to what is happening in this altercation. But what's interesting about the Black Panther Party, and what I think a lot of people forget, is that within the first year or so, they put down the guns. They put down the weapons. They were like, actually, this is kind of a double-edged sword. This is making us more a target of violence than it is a beneficiary of it. And they realized what was more important in their community was to make sure that their community was fed and healthy and literate. So they started free breakfast programs that spread all over the country. They had free health clinics. They had sickle cell testing. They had an ambulance program. And I think Hoover realized as well, the director of the FBI, that what was more terrifying to an American populace was actually not armed Black people. It was fed, literate, healthy Black people. And that is why they came after the Black Panther Party. You know, we have the Black Panther Party to thank for free breakfast today. My kids live in the lily white suburbs and they have free breakfast and free lunch at their school because of the groundwork that the Black Panther Party put in. I think they realized that protection is not always about a gun. Protection is about food. Protection is about literacy. Protection is about good health. Protection is about a safe community and access to resources. And that for me is like the biggest success story of the Black Panther Party. But, you know, history has demonized them in such a way in which, you know, we see the berets, we see the black leather, and we're like, oh, they're, you know, they're terrifying. And that's actually not the work that they were invested in.
Let's jump to to joy in terms of how that can be an expression as well, because I want to also be able to sort of generalize this a little bit. But, but tell us about how joy as a tool to respond to injustice works.
So this was the best and hardest chapter for me to write. It's the last chapter. I really see joy as a weapon. I see joy as a bomb. I see joy as so many different things. And really sort of like the pinnacle of the Black experience is actually not one of trauma and violence, but one of joy and humor. And I sort of encapsulate that in the Alabama brawl. When we think about August of 2023, when these Black dock worker was attacked, and all of a sudden all these Black people came to his response on this dock in Alabama, and people are swimming to the dock, a 16-year-old swimming to the dock, and you've got a man swinging a folding chair. And what gave me so much joy in that moment is not just to see Black people defending another Black person. Absolutely, yes. But it was the memes and the gifs and the humor and the reenactment and the joy that came, like almost the celebration and mockery of whiteness in that moment, where it was like poking fun at white supremacy to sort of rob it of its legitimacy. Like that to me was everything. I saw people with merch. They had like folding chair earrings and they had t-shirts, and I was like, Black people, only Black people, we will make fun of something. We will poke fun. We will take something that could be, you know, really violent, like a white woman calling the police on Black people barbecuing, and we will make it a hashtag or a punchline. We'll call you Barbecue Becky, and we'll make jokes about that. And I think there are just ways in which Black people are always trying to sort of laugh to keep from crying, and sort of using joy to fortify them and to protect them during really hard and difficult times. You know, I think about the joy that kind of came from the pandemic. I mean, you think about people dying and sickness all around you. And again, the gifts and the memes and sort of the mockery and humor that came from that moment, I'll never forget that. And it just is a message to me that even when we see Black people marching in the streets and sort of chanting, I can't breathe, and then, you know, 2 minutes later, somebody will break out into the electric slide and Frankie Beverly will start to play. And then all of a sudden it's like a block party. And you're like, wait, how did we go from this to this? Because Black people need joy. We need joy in order to survive. It is what affirms our humanity. And so I wanted to end with that, because if we have nothing else, we have each other. And when we have each other, there is always joy and laughter to be found.
I mean, this is obviously, you know, people understand it's, you know, it's a history of Black resistance and the various forms that it takes. And on some level meant to be prescriptive in terms of a resource for future resistance. Sure. What about, like, you know, we're in an era where the need for resistance could be a little bit wider than within the context of the Black community and its allies. I mean, that you know, I mean, we'll find out with immigrants, right? But also,
trans people, women, you name it.
But also, you know, people who want, just broadly speaking, maintain some semblance of at least the structure of a democracy, sure, as opposed to an oligarchy. What lessons can be taken here that are more, I guess, you know, that can be extrapolated, that aren't necessarily a function of the history of oppression of Black people in the context of this country, or endemic to cultural responses to this oppression? Like, what are there lessons that you see that can be taken to a broader audience? Or I should say a broader, not audience per se, but broader, I guess, use.
Yes, populace, sure. I mean, absolutely. I didn't just write this book for Black people, even though I tell people all the time that this is my sort of love letter to the Black community. Refusal is collective and refusal is global. And you see that all over the world. You are seeing people refuse tyranny, refuse oligarchy, refuse, these really oppressive systems. And I think now more than anything, we need deep and wide coalitions. We need people coming together to push back, to refuse against the power structures that be, because we're all getting our clock clean. We're all paying $12 for eggs. We are all having to navigate healthcare in a very unjust system. And so I want people to refuse, and I want people to sort of kind of take a letter from Gen Z. I mean, if there's one thing I've learned from my students, it's that binaries do not serve us well. The idea that it's right, it's wrong, it's good, it's bad, it's Black, it's white, it's this, it's that, it's violence or it's nonviolence. I think we have an array of tools at our disposal that we can get creative, that we need everyone. We need the engineer and the poet. We need the graffiti artist and the medical doctor. We need the teacher and the politician. This is an all hands on deck moment. When we refuse, we have to stand up against all of these power structures. Now, I make it plain in the book. Like, if you want a 3-point plan, if you want a formula, that is not this book.
Right, no.
if you want me to solve racism by 2035, that's not going to happen. But I think if you want to talk about what's not working, we should talk about that and discard that. And we should start to get really creative about what could work. What possibilities do we have out there? How can we gather all of our efforts and talents and abilities and chip away at this problem? We're not going to swallow the ocean. I can't do that, but I can do what I do best, which is write books and teach history and speak about this. And others will find their own talents and abilities to partner with others and to keep that work going.
It seems to me that one of the biggest challenges, and again, yes, I don't know if anybody has a solution at this moment of any of this, but how do these sort of methodologies or perspectives of resistance get translated when you're talking about populations that have not been defined by their fate? So in other words, solidarity across amongst Black people, it was sort of defined by the oppressor on some level. You guys are slaves, we're all slaves, or we're second-class citizens, or we're being discriminated against. If you say, a poet or a plumber, if we all do poetry together, we have at least some comment. Like, what becomes the how do we create around that solidarity?
The coalescing, you mean the coalescing factor? Yeah, I think, and maybe
particularly when there's a significant percentage of people can just say I can pass.
Yeah,
I can pay whatever that translates into.
I mean, listen, I think
my taxes are being cut, so.
I think there are a lot of people, and that's why Trump is in office, that voted not just in their interests in terms of white supremacy, but in terms of the aspirations that whiteness provides. And I think that, you will find people all the time that are not white, but aspirationally seek to be, or in close proximity to that kind of power structure, and that will sell out again and again to get some sort of power or to gain some sort of protection. But I think at the end of the day, and maybe this is the optimist in me, maybe I'm wearing rose-colored glasses, but I think we all want healthy bodies. We all want healthy communities. We all want to be safe. We all want to make a decent living. We all want to be able to afford the homes that we live in. We all want to be able to have access to education. We all want to be able to live our lives. Trans people want to be able to live their lives safely without harm. Most people who are undocumented workers, they want to be able to live their lives. They want to be able to provide for their families. And I don't think what people want is sort of so far-fetched. Now, is everyone going to be a millionaire? No. Should everyone be a millionaire? No. But should everyone have access to housing and to healthcare and to education and to job opportunities and to be represented when they turn on the TV and when they see, art performed for them? I think those things matter. I actually think more people want that than not. And I think that we have a lot more in common than we think. Whiteness and white supremacy is a problem, but so is capitalism. And capitalism is cleaning a lot of our clocks. So is patriarchy. Patriarchy is cleaning a lot of our clocks. And I think that when we galvanize against those power structures, when it's not just about whiteness, when it's also about wealth, and I mean uncontrollable, unsustainable kinds of wealth, when it's also about, marginalizing a whole half of the population, those are things that have to be tackled. And I do think that there's more solidarity than there is opposition. And I tell people all the time, if this is encouraging to them, because I studied the abolitionists, my first book was on the abolitionist movement. The abolitionists were only 1% of the population. 1%. Like, they were not all of the North. They were a small sector. And I think all you need is a small group of committed people willing to make sacrifice, willing to find consensus, willing to find solidarity, and you can change the world over. The abolitionists did it. And I don't think we necessarily need, everyone to be in agreement in order to do this work. We need committed people. We need people willing to make sacrifice and people willing to work together.
Kellie Carter Jackson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College, author. The book is We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.